In order to give you the full experience of an expert, pardon me. He is an expert, but he's more an expert in guest of honor experience. It is a distinct pleasure all the way from Auckland, New Zealand, still adjusting to time change here in Canada, en route to Bologna. So we haven't exactly just brought him in for this. He is en route to Italy, and so those of us that are leaving on flights in the next few days will have a chance to see Kevin in the hallways. But I introduce to you Kevin Chapman, who's going to speak for the next 45 minutes about the guest of honor experience. So, kia ora, Kevin.
Thank you. You may regret that. And thank you for not putting steps in. On Sunday night, I was at a minor literary festival and I had to interview one of my authors. And so I walked up onto the stage in front of him, tripped on the step, fell on the stage, dropped my glass of water all over my notes. So I'm already ahead of the game. Now, I'm just going to talk about what a guest of honor is, because actually I think that's one of the areas that people often don't get much information about. Some of you will know all this. Feel free to stay and be bored. You won't be the first audience I've had that has stayed and been bored. But New Zealand was guest of honor in 2012. Our brand was While You Were Sleeping. The context being that while you were sleeping in Europe, we were awake in New Zealand and working hard and creatively. It was a brand that, like everything else on our program, got severely criticised by certain members of our community. And one of the things I've been telling Alison and Caroline and Gillian and all the others is that no matter what you do, you'll get criticised. In fact, one of our mottos was, the only way to avoid being criticised is to do nothing, and that is too high a price to pay. So I really want to just start with understanding what a guest of honour program is. A guest of honour program is a platform for promoting Canada in Germany, or New Zealand in Germany, or the Arab world in Germany, or any of those other things that have been guest of honour. It is a relatively blank slate when it is offered to you by the Frankfurt Book Fair, but the aim is, with a book and cultural base, to promote your country. It is a substantial thing. Every country has its own aims. So when we were looking at what we would try and, when we were selling it to government, because this is something that traditionally the publishing industry sells to government and then the government gets on board and gets deeply involved in, I talked to a lot of previous guests of honour about what their aims were. My favourite was Lithuania. They were guest of honour around 2002, I think. The head of their guest of honour program said our aim was simple. It was to explain to Germans that we weren't Russian. The Icelandic aim was primarily to sell the Icelandic sagas into foreign languages. Our aim as a guest of honour was to promote New Zealand in as many ways as possible, as widely through Germany as we could. Every guest of honour gets a contract. The contract, in our case, was signed between the Frankfurt Book Fair and our Ministry for Culture and Heritage. The contract that we had was reasonably simple. It required us to take advantage to put together a pavilion in a space that they would provide that would give a signal of our culture to Germany. It required us to have an author and books program. It required us to have a culture program. It required us to have a translation program, a program that would fund translation of our works into foreign languages. And it required a Books On program, which is something that they do for the guest of honour, and they go out around the world and they collect books on the guest of honour, and you then have to make a place for the showing of those books in your pavilion. That becomes tricky, has become tricky in the past with certain totalitarian regimes who haven't liked what some of those books have said about their countries and have gone to great lengths to remove those books from their pavilion, to such a degree that occasionally the Frankfurt Book Fair has had to bring in its own security guards to guard the Books On program in somebody else's pavilion. And public perception's really important around guest of honour because around promotion. The Frankfurt Book Fair Guest of Honour brand has a massive public perception in Germany, probably over 90% perception. Ordinary Germans know what the Guest of Honour program is. Small town newspapers will carry double-page stories on your Guest of Honour. One of the constant sort of things I overcame was people going, why do we care about what New Zealand's doing at a book fair in Germany? It wasn't what we were doing at a book fair in Germany, it was what we were doing all through Germany. So, what will happen? The centrepiece of your pavilion, of your guest of honour, will be the pavilion in the Frankfurt Book Fair. This is a 2,500 square metre empty space for you to make a cultural statement. This will probably be the most expensive part of your entire guest of honour budget. It is open to the public on the weekend, and they flood in, or they flooded into ours to such a degree that they had to close the doors and only open them every 30 minutes and let people in and out. So that's your empty space, and everybody does something different with it. That was the Catalan pavilion. That's China. That's Argentina. That was Iceland. Iceland were the year before us. I loved Iceland. They just made it into this homey environment. That was ours. Brazil. I found that quite sterile. Finland. Indonesia. Flanders and Netherlands. And France. So everybody does something with their pavilion. In the pavilion, you will normally have your books, your author program as well, which is essentially a writers' festival of your authors that you put on a program and people come and see. The books and author program for you guys will be a major part. So you have two parts to that. You're taking your authors to Germany and you're putting them all over the place, and how you choose them and what sort of focus you have around that is critical and is potentially one of the most divisive issues of your guest of honour. There is nothing more pissed off than an author who doesn't get selected for a Frankfurt Book Fair. And they will say so loudly, and they will say so often. Ours are still talking about it. And they will criticise everything you do, regardless of the fact that they should never have qualified anyway. You have a cultural program, and the extent of your cultural program's up to the people running the thing. We based ours around dance and music. We put in Maori dance groups, we put in Pacifica dance groups, but we put in all sorts of other stuff as well. We had a tape art exhibition. You know how you make art out of tape? On the sides of walls in Frankfurt. Public relations is a key part because your guys have to hire a German public relations company who will spread the word. And this is a big part of it, an expensive part of it, and an incredibly time-consuming part of it for the staff of the program. You may have a political program. We did. Our Deputy Prime Minister came and opened our program. We had 3 ministers, I think, and they used it as a chance to talk to a whole lot of political people in Germany. The protocol program was substantial. And you may or may not have a trade program. Once again, we were trying to do everything, so we did have a trade program, and for us it centred around Museumsüberfest, which is an end of August festival on the banks of the River Main in Frankfurt. Around 2 million people over 3 days, visiting museums, listening to music, and getting sold New Zealand food and wine. Worked for us. And that's a picture of Museumsüberfest. There you go. Where will it be? Well, the opening ceremony, which is your early introduction to guest of honour. And that, I just went the wrong way. And that is in here, in the conference centre at the front of the fair. The entire Canadian Guest of Honour program enters as a group into this highly orchestrated opening ceremony, which has political speakers from Frankfurt, from the state of Hesse, from the federal government, from your government, literary speakers. You enter last as a group, and you exit first as a group at the end of the opening ceremony. And you go from there to your pavilion, which, if I got this right, is actually, this is the forum, and that's where the pavilion is. So in the forum, so you have troop from here across to here. The opening of the pavilion is a big deal. Well, that's the first anybody gets to see it. Nobody can see the pavilion before the opening. It's a state secret. Sometimes it's a grand unveiling that people are happy about, and sometimes it's not. Your program will be in various halls around. So you guys are in Hall 6 with us Kiwis, but if you're like us, you'll have activities all around these halls, and the cooking hall and the comics hall, on the German stands, and in this agora, this big open place, and also, of course, in your pavilion. The fact that you're all over the place is actually quite important. And then, of course, you have activities around Frankfurt. There's a program called Writers in the Railway Station. There's writers in the Literature House. There's writers everywhere. There's dance and such like everywhere. So you're all around Frankfurt. You're also all around Germany. Berlin Writers Festival, Cologne. Oh, shut up. We put on activities in around 60 German towns and cities, including a travelling film festival of New Zealand films made from books. And you've got people in Germany, you've got Austria and Switzerland where there are German-speaking programs, and then you get people in France go, oh, well, while they're there, can they come over here? So actually, your program travels even outside of Germany. So a bit bigger than just a little book fair in Frankfurt. What can you do? Well, I know you're going to be working on the book catalogue. It's important to note that what happens with a guest of honour is German publishers are waiting to buy guest of honour publishers' books for the guest of honour year. They are hungry for your books because that's one of the things that they do to make spread the guest of honour word. The catalogue's a key part of it, and I would suggest that one of the things you should try and do is not prejudge too much about what goes into it. So when everything for us was condensed. So we signed the contract in May of 2011. In October of 2011, we got our guest scroll and we became guest of honour for the following year. So we crashed a catalogue. So in this catalogue selection, I had them do it the judging in a meeting room downstairs in my offices at Hachette, New Zealand. And at one stage I wandered down and they were having a break. And I said, how's it going? And they said, oh, it's quite good, but we've had to put aside all these books. I said, what sort of books have you put aside? Oh, we put aside anything on World War I or World War II. I said, why? Well, why would the Germans want to buy anything on World War I or World War II? I said, maybe we'd better rethink this, because Germans actually publish and read a lot on the World Wars. They wouldn't believe me. In the end, I had to get on the phone to a German friend who worked in British publishing and give them the phone, and she said, just put them back in the mix. And then they'd put aside a whole lot of stuff on Maori culture. I said, the Germans are massively interested in Maori. They're massively interested in indigenous cultures generally. All those museums along the mine, half of them are based on ethnography. And in fact, Maori interest titles were one of our biggest sellers during Guest of Honour. So don't prejudge too much. It's important that you make your authors available, and not just for Frankfurt in 2020, but for Leipzig in earlier 2020, for other things. You want to be promoting your authors to the Guest of Honour team to get them into Germany. Now, we had very strict criteria. We said you can't go to Germany unless you're published in German, because what's the point of putting you there if there's nothing for the German public to engage with? We said you need to have we need to have a German partner for you, preferably your publisher, but possibly a literature house or a festival, so that when we've finished using you, they can spend some money using you as well. And if you don't have those two, the only way you'll go is if you're some sort of literary icon that we don't feel we can leave out. But even then, it was quite tough sometimes to get authors to go, and when publishers didn't support us, then we were left scratching trying to get up to our target of 80. So get them to write, if they qualify, get them to write to their editors in Germany and generate interest from their publishers. Information on right sales. When you're selling rights, I don't know what happens here, but we had a major problem because we didn't record sales of rights in New Zealand. If people told the Publishers Association, we recorded it, but generally, a lot of New Zealand books are sold into other countries by agents who often aren't based in New Zealand, or by overseas publishers who have those rights. We were lucky in that we found a piece of research from a German PhD student that had identified over 20 years all the New Zealand books that have been published in Germany. And it was bloody perfect. It told us that in 20 years, 201 books had been published. So 10 a year. So when after the signing, a radio interviewer put a microphone under my nose and said, what is your target for translations? And it wasn't something we'd even discussed. I was able to at least know 10 a year. 80, I said, which nobody questioned and quickly became the target. But we think we got closer to 200. But once again, after a while, we didn't actually have a method of recording those sales, because we were only in contact really with the publishers operating in New Zealand. So all the New Zealand publishers tell us when they've made a right sales, but if Whittier Meyer is being sold by an agent in the UK, we don't know. So that in terms of measuring, that's one thing that I'd be trying to look at, because when governments give you money, they expect you to be able to articulate your results. And publishers, for some reason, are really reluctant to just tell people when they've made sales. Maybe it's laziness. I wouldn't say that. Volunteer. That's what you can do. You can volunteer because there is so much more work to be done here than the team can ever do. So they need people to help when they're planning overseas to take people to Leipzig or overseas trade missions. They need people to help on catalogue production. They need people to help on all the administration and then when you get to Frankfurt, they need people to help on the stand and things like that. Believe me, you get a kick out of a guest of honour. There are those sorts of kicks, and there's great kicks, but you get a big kick out of being a guest of honour and of helping. And differently to volunteering, support. As I've said, there will be criticism. The worst criticism is when it comes from within your own publishing community and it's ill thought out. We had some authors start a campaign against us on why we had a cultural program and why it wasn't just taking authors to Frankfurt. And it was a really effective campaign. It reached national media. And it was reasonably easy in the end to just go on the radio and say, well, actually, we have a cultural program because the contract requires a cultural program, so we don't have a guest of honour without it. And then they said, well, why are there 100 cultural performers and only 80 authors? I went, well, one author is an event. 40 kapa haka dancers is one event. So we have a lot more events and we're spending a lot more money on authors, and it all went away. But what really got our goat was publishers who started to support those authors with this specious campaign because they hadn't bothered to ask us why we had a cultural campaign. So running guest of honour, I can tell you now from personal experience that what Caroline Fortin's going to do is spend 3 years doing an unpaid full-time job outside her normal job, because that's what I did. So getting kicked in the guts by her own isn't something she needs. End of that lesson? This might be close to my heart, you see. How can you maximise? Well, I think one of the things is you want to actually try and be into everything. As a publisher, you want to try and get yourself involved. So when they say, we're looking at people to go to Leipzig, we're looking at people to be in the catalogue, we're looking at people to do this, I think you want to actually say to yourself, can I make value out of this? I certainly had publishers who just sort of went, Frankfurt's not useful to me. And we knew it would be, but they'd written it off before they started. There is real value in Frankfurt in the Guest of Honour program. And the other thing I'd say is a multi-year activity. Some people think that Guest of Honour is about going to Frankfurt in the year of Guest of Honour. Actually, one shot is no shot. Publishing's a relationship game. You have to build relationships. You should be, if you haven't been going to Frankfurt, you should be going this year, you should be going next year, and you should be going in Guest of Honour year. And then, as a result of that, you should be going year and year after that in order to concrete those relationships and to carry on and build more. This is a real opportunity for some people that have never been working Frankfurt to start working Frankfurt and to get real value for years and years going ahead. I've made overseas sales where I've had the same meeting with the same publisher for 5 or 6 years, and then finally they go, the time's right to buy that book. So you can't treat it as a short term. And when you're there, to maximise, you go to Guest of Honour activities. You don't park your ass in Hall 6 and go from there to a party and go to bed. There's so much going on in a Guest of Honour year, so you get out and you get among it, and you'll find that when you're among it, you start talking to people and you start meeting other publishers, which is Does seem to be a theme today, doesn't it? Socialise. I'm so horrified by that Thomas Minkus story. He goes to bed at midnight. What the hell is he doing? Hmm? Well, that's almost the same. Anyway, I'm sure I've seen him drunk at 3 in the morning. But do, because one of the great things about Guest of Honour is that you see so many other things from your own country that you haven't noticed that are going on. Guest of Honour makes you proud of your country, but you want to maximise it. Yeah, the whole point, in a way, is to sell a bucket load of books. We have a technical term for that in New Zealand. It's called a shitload. The way you do that is by preparing, by doing your research, by going often, by meeting people, and by talking constantly. Every time you sell books, you're doing the Guest of Honour program in Canada a favour, because they're not spending all this money so that you can go to Frankfurt and have a party. They're spending this money to develop an economic program that will give well-being to the country. And only an idiot would go, there's this big investment, there's this big opportunity, and there's this big nada because I can't be bothered. So you will, if you get involved, sell a lot. And I did make one final note here. Most importantly, Friday night at Frankfurt is the New Zealand party. We have it Friday night because there's a whole group of people, especially Brits, who go home Thursday and Friday. They're what we call the lightweights. They're the managing directors of the major companies and the senior staff who don't stay around, and the real workers are still there on Friday night. So we have a party on Friday night, and we supply New Zealand wine, and people are welcome. Thank you. On the off chance that there's a question, I'll stay here.
You mentioned that it was relatively easy for you to gather data in terms of rights sales that were happening in the lead up to. How did you do that?
It was relatively easy because we had it established within the Publishers Association to get it from New Zealand publishers, but we had funding for staffing to actually get it from everywhere else. That staffing lasted less than 18 months, and then we know how many sales we made in that time, and then the funding went away. So ever since then, we've lost all that information. Publishers self-report what they sell, but what UK agent sold, no. And that's really underreporting sales. You like New Zealanders, you don't like to ask questions.
What was the drop-off rate the year following the Guest of Honour? Do you have any numbers on whether rights dropped off dramatically in terms of sales the following year?
Rights did drop off, but went nowhere back to where they'd started, and haven't been back to where they started since. So we got a big rise like that. And then it dropped off because, those same publishers that are coming to Canada to say, I want to publish a Canadian book in 2020 and you can bring an author and we can promote and those sorts of things, are then moving on to who's in 2021? Spain. But you've established the relationships and they discover that the Canadian books sell, so you become a more attractive partner for them. There were internal things that we didn't do so well in terms of the way we communicated. The way we communicated to what people love to call stakeholders. But we communicated quite well to the heads of the authors community, but we didn't dig down deeply enough and communicate to them. We found that when they got critical, if either myself or Sarah was my Gillian, went out and spoke to them and explained things, a lot of the criticism died off, not all of it, but we were massively sort of short of resources. Given the time period we were doing this and the money we had, we prioritised, and sometimes, but I think that was probably the biggest thing. You know, there were things that we failed to do. We failed to get tourism on board with it, but then almost everybody else I talk to says tourism is never on board with a guest of honour. They're just difficult. The best thing that we got from New Zealand tourism was a moment of quiet clarity where they said, "We don't play well when we're not in charge." So you know, given more time, we might have been able to get more sponsorship money. I don't know, but perhaps my biggest regret is communication.
On your screen it says sell, 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 and you said there was an uptick in right sales, and then you mentioned tourism, boosted tourism as well, Western Europe to Germany. Were there any other broader economic benefits you saw from the guest of honor presence?
Yeah, Jürgen, who runs Frankfurt, came down to New Zealand a number of times, but he came down about 18 months after our guest of honour, and we wandered around all the ministries and agencies that we'd engaged with and asked one question, really: are you satisfied with your engagement with the guest of honour program? And interestingly, they all said yes. Trade and Enterprise, who are our export trade arm, agency of government, said that they had surpassed all of the targets they set themselves in terms of people finding new distributors, or even Weta Workshop. Right, Weta Workshop is world famous. They do all the technical stuff for Lord of the Rings, for Avatar. They're just massively famous. Richard Taylor, Sir Richard Taylor, who runs it, and who's got, I think, I don't know how many Oscars lined up in his boardroom, said that guest of honour opened doors for them in Germany that they had been knocking on for years. I should have told you that first, shouldn't I? I'd forgotten that. Publishers came to me in 2011 when we were just starting to take up the scroll, and said, there are people I've been trying to meet for years who have suddenly turned up in my booth and said, why don't we talk? Tourism, who we love, sort of like brothers and sisters love each other when they got knives in their hands. Tourism, we did meet with, Jürgen and I. When we walked out, Jürgen said, either we find a drink or I slit my wrists. They reported, but would not report publicly, that the perception of New Zealand as a cultural destination had taken a big jump. But because they were against it, they wouldn't put it in their figures. They'd fudged it and said, well, it could be the after effects of Lord of the Rings.
So that would have been my question, actually, in terms of the perception of your country in Germany. How has it changed? And I guess you can only know whether it actually did by examining what the perception was before and after. So I don't know if there were any studies done beforehand and compared to what the perception was afterwards.
Yeah, no, tourism have ongoing polling in Germany. of what people think about and when the name New Zealand is mentioned, and what they are thinking about because everybody talks about coming to visit and not many people do. You know, we're in a way we're the opposite of Winnipeg, which I remember somebody at a Canadian Booksellers Awards once saying, she was getting an award for editor of the year, and she said freelance editors are like Winnipeg. Everybody flies over, looks down and says, I must go there, and never does. So with New Zealand, we know that there are some things. Lord of the Rings was a big thing because it highlighted scenery. So they think scenery, they think All Blacks, but because of Guest of Honour, that whole cultural element, writing, dancing, music, it came up in all their measures. Caroline.
What about the pavilion? How did you come up with this fantastic idea? How did you work it out?
The pavilion.
Yes.
No, but the pavilion, you know, one of the great things is that if you don't tell people what you want, they'll come up with brilliant stuff. So and when you do tell people what you want, they'll be constrained. So the request for proposal that went out from the ministry to a whole lot of designers, architects and such like for the pavilion was about what the outcome needed to be. And this particular architect and event promoter got together and created that pavilion idea. And I, for one, when I saw it, I was gobsmacked because I thought, you know, how the hell did their minds go there? But it was because we didn't try and tell them what we wanted.
And it was like designers and architects.
It was a firm of architects and a firm whose job essentially was to put on events. So they would do things like they would manage the launch of a Commonwealth Games. So they were used to putting sound, light, film, entertainers all into an environment where they could tell stories. And that's what our pavilion was about, telling the story of New Zealand.
So just to clarify, you didn't say what you wanted, you just said what the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, basically we said there are certain rules, you know. You have to have space for the author festivals part. You have to have space for books on. And apart from that, what we have to do is we have to somehow tell the story of New Zealand. We have to, you know, we have to say what New Zealanders are, things like that. What we didn't say was, they've just laid a brand new parquet floor, please do not put water on it. So they came up with the idea of an island in the middle of water, which created a lot of discussion about insurance. And then for Books On, they built these 5 metre high sort of teepee-ish pavilions, and a 20-minute AV that started with the Maori myth around the creation of the world, and went on into all how stories were told, using New Zealand books, New Zealand film, and it was so designed that sometimes the whole thing was played on all of the screens. So there were 3 fronts to each of the pavilions, and sometimes the same image was showed on all 3, and sometimes it moved across them all, and sometimes there were differing imagery. And inside the pavilions were the books on, hanging from steel wires. So you could walk into a pavilion and look at all these books about New Zealand. And then for 2 out of the every 3 20-minute AVs, we had a Maori actor standing in the water reciting lines, and the third one, so that he could go downstairs and drink whiskey, because he needed it because he was losing his voice because he was under a waterfall. That was just, the sound was on the AV. But none of us would have, you know. So, yeah, we just...
You've seen many of the pavilions since, and you've seen yours. I remember getting in
people look for different things. I mean, we're one of our writers' groups commissioned an article last year, Frankfurt Guest of Honor 5 years on, and all these people said we hated the pavilion. It won international awards. My German publisher didn't like the pavilion. I mean, I don't give a shit. I mean, it worked. It attracted something like 90,000 people. You know, we were standing in the pavilion on Saturday night the year before when Haldor, who run Iceland, and who I got to know quite well, and they were having a party because post the financial meltdown in Iceland, they had still managed to put on a really fantastic guest of honour. And he just leant over to me and said, beat that. They had about 40,000 people through their pavilion. So I sent him a Maori Punamu afterwards and said, I think we did okay. But, you know, we had record numbers, we won international awards, and still people have said, I didn't like your pavilion. So we think it was about 90. We realised that we had an issue when they started closing the doors and lining people up down the escalators. And then and this was about day 3, we started counting, and I think we counted 67,000 after that. But it's a good idea, unless you're going to put a sort of static museum-y, you know, and this is the tomahawk that Hu Flang Dung threw at whatchamacallit, you know, like a really boring museum. You will get lots of people. The more you engage with them, the more you're doing your job.
What do we have to be, 90,000?
I just... Look, to be honest, we were sitting down with the architects and they were talking at plans of how to move people through that pavilion. And they said, we think we can get 90,000. And I went, you're dreaming. We'll be lucky to get to top Iceland's 40. I buy him a lot of wine now, that architect. We all right? We're ahead.
I just want to add something. Thank you. Well, let's thank. I just thought I'd quickly jump in. Kevin brought up the catalog and selection of catalog. Just so you all know, we have a catalog that's in process right now, and it's self-curated. So if you haven't heard about it yet, we've been publicizing it through many different associations and ourselves, and if you're not on our newsletter, come and talk to us later. But Isabelle Gauvin, who's here, my colleague from Montreal, please come and talk to us if you don't know about this online catalog that we're in the process of curating, and we've started to promote it to our German contacts, and it's a great tool, and we really, really would love for every Canadian Ontario publisher to participate in this. So please come and talk to us later on today if you haven't already heard about it. And if you have heard about it and you have not submitted any titles for it or on it, please do so very soon. This is really, really crucial and ties in very nicely with the translation incentive that was launched last week. So thank you.